Hello, everybody. Hello, Java developers. How are you guys? Thank you for joining us. Today, we have a very, very interesting host and a very, very interesting topic. We have today Simon. Hi, Simon.
Hey everybody,
Hi, how are you? How's it going? Good?
it's going great. Thanks for
Thank you.
having me.
Thank you so much, really, for accepting our invitation and talking to us today. Thank you so much. Uh, yes, so let's give a little introduction about the React Java user group. Is honestly established recently, like a couple of months ago, and we host everybody. Everybody is welcome to speak in our jug. Today we have Simon. He is a very well-known Java champion. He's also a Vaden champion. He is a speaker, a programmer, an architect. He is like hopefully everywhere. He's really open, very active in the Twitter. So please do reach him and do subscribe to his Twitter account. Uh, yeah, without further ado, please, the stage is yours, Simon. Good
Thank you
luck.
very much. The title of my talk is Do You Really Need Hibernate? Now, I don't know if you know that, but there is a law called Bedridge's Law. Ian Bedridge is a journalist from England, and he found out that if an article has a title with a question mark, the answer is usually no. But we are developers, so the answer is usually it depends. So I'm Simon from Switzerland. You can reach me on simas_ch on Twitter. I'm also on Mastodon, or I have my website on martinelli.ch. And I'm already working in the Java field for 24 years now. I have my own company in Switzerland. I'm also a Java user group leader in Bern in Switzerland. So you can also join Java user group in Switzerland. We often have also online events if you want to join, or if you're in Switzerland, just come and say hello. Now, before I start talking about Hibernate, I like to talk to you about track and field. So I'm in a sports club in Switzerland since I'm a little boy. And beside other sports, we also do track and field. And every year we have 3 competitions for kids where they can come and they do long jump and running like the guys here on the picture, or doing shot put or throwing balls and stuff like that. And when I came out of school, they had these events, and the problem there was they did everything by hand. And they needed around 15 people to create a ranking list, to calculate all the points and stuff. And when I became a software engineer, I thought, hey, this shouldn't be done by hand. You should do that with software. And so I created a track and field application. The first version was with Excel, later Access. And then when I became a Java developer, I thought, okay, this must be Java. And in the meanwhile, it's a Vaadin application with jOOQ. And I will show you that today. It's available on jdaf.ch. By the way, it's open source. It's on GitHub. You can use it. If you have a track and field club and want to organize small competitions, you can use that for free. So what's special about this application? Maybe we can have a look at it. That's how it looked like. It's in German, but it doesn't really matter to understand it. So what we see here is a dashboard. We have some competitions like the competition for the kids. We have other competitions where we have multiple competitions with one series. And what we can do here, we can like enter results, for example. And this will calculate the points if we change the data, for example, to 1340 or something. You can see here that the data is changed. So this is a typical business application. We also have parts where we can edit data. For example, we can edit the athletes, and here we can change data, save it, the grid will be updated. We can filter the grid, for example. We can sort it, whatever. So this is a typical business application, I would call that. It's data-centric, and there's a special functionality, or the goal of the application is to create a ranking list by the end of the competition. And beside of the tabular data that you have seen, the ranking list is a tree. So we have the competition, we have categories. Now here are the boys. That's my son, by the way, here, Lucas, and his age is 2005. That's the points he get, and these are the results for 80 meters, long jump, etc. So the special thing about that is the tree, but other than that, we just have tabular data. Now let's get back to the presentation, and to better understand maybe what we will see in the demo is the data model. So what I added recently is an organization. So the application now is multi-tenant capable, so you can use it for multiple tenants. For example, many clubs can use the same application, and it's just installed once. And then we have for sure the athletes. So in our case, the kids that want to start at the competitions, they may or not be member of a club. Then we have series and competitions. So a series is maybe you watch track and field in the television, then you may have already seen Diamond League or Golden League. So these are competition series where at the end of the series, there will be a ranking list over the series and not only per competition. Then we have the competition, and we have categories. So as you've seen before in the ranking list, we have kids in different ages. We have boys and girls, so this forms a category. Then we have events. An event is like long jump or 80 meter sprint or 1,000-meter run or something like that. And finally, we enter the results, so we have this data model. We will see that in a minute. Also in the demo, I use the same data model as I do in my application, also for the demo. Now, when it comes to persistence in Java, we usually have, or we usually use JPA or Hibernate as the most dominant or the dominant JPA implementation. We use OR mapping. But the question is not really which framework to use. It's more about how we look at the data or how we interact with the data in our applications. And there are two approaches, and one is called entity state transition. So entity state transition is what you usually do with JPA and Hibernate. That means you load entities, you change the data, so you change the state of the entity, and finally you tell Hibernate to update the database. So you don't have to care about insert update statements, you just change the state. On the other hand, we have something called dataset transformation, and that's more or less what I did in the application before. So if I edit an athlete, for example, I read the dataset, so the athlete table record, then I enter the data, and finally I save that back to the database. So in a data-centric application, you have more or less something like dataset transformation. Now the question is, which one should you use? Now the point is, as always, it depends, and there is no best approach. It really depends on the use case. And what I like to show you today, because I assume that if you're a Java developer, you already seen JPA or heard about JPA and Hibernate or use it already for already a long time. And so I like to show you what this jOOQ is. So jOOQ stands for Java Object-Oriented Querying, and is the idea to generate Java code from your database and use a Fluent API to build your SQL statements. To start with the jOOQ, you can use my example project. It's on github.com. cmach is my GitHub username, and there is jOOQ examples. There is also official documentation. There's the jOOQ website where you find everything You will also see that there's something called download pricing. That means jOOQ has a dual licensing model. So if you're on an open source database on the most recent versions, like Postgres or MariaDB, you can use it for free. There are then Express or professional versions if you use a commercial database, and I think that's perfectly fair, because if you pay a lot of money for your database, you can also pay a little money just for the database access layer. Now here you also find documentation. There is a multi-page documentation where you also can search in the documentation, and it has different sections that you can have a look at it. And I will show you more or less that. Just if you want to dig into jOOQ yourself, you can go to the documentation. And there is also a demo. It has a different data model that you can use with jOOQ directly. Now, jOOQ has some constraint, and the constraint is jOOQ assumes that you already have a database in place. So jOOQ doesn't make any rules, so you can use any database that you like. Any data model would work with jOOQ. It really doesn't matter. It also doesn't matter if it's MySQL, MariaDB, or whatever. jOOQ more or less supports every SQL database that is out there. Now, how does jOOQ work? jOOQ has two parts. So in the upper hand, you see that there's this jOOQ DSL. We will see that in a minute. It's DSL, domain-specific language, that looks like SQL, but you write it in Java code. Now, if you write SQL in Java code, if you use strings, for example, and use directly JDBC, then you often have a problem. First of all, you don't know if the SQL statement is correct, so you have to write a test for it. So that's the first thing that is better with jOOQ, because the DSL only allows to write valid SQL statements. And on the other hand, you also have these table names and column names and other object names of the database, and you can misspell them and you will get a runtime error. With jOOQ, there is a jOOQ generator that will generate Java classes from your database. And so you will have objects or classes for all the objects in the database, like tables, views, columns, etc. We will see that when we build SQL with jOOQ. And it's more or less the same approach as if you use JPA with the model gen. So if you use, for example, JPA criteria API, you can also generate the metadata. And with the meta model that is generated by the meta model generator from JPA and Hibernate, you also have a type-safe way to write your queries. But the difference here is you don't have an intermediate model like you have with Hibernate, like the entity model. You directly use the database model that's in the database. One question that was asked during one of my presentations in the past was, does jOOQ scale? Now the point is jOOQ scales because you can use it for any project of any size. And in fact, jOOQ was created by Lukas Eder. He's also from Switzerland, when he was working for a Swiss bank, and they had a huge data model with very complex SQL statements, and he was tired of using JDBC or OR mapping to access the database, and so he created jOOQ to have a more database-centric way to do querying. In my case, I use jOOQ for an ERP product currently, and this product has 2,000 tables, and all the business logic is in stored procedures and functions. So there are around 5,000 of those. And the good thing about jOOQ is it's the easiest way to call stored procedures, because you will have a Java class for each stored procedure, and you can create that with new, like you instantiate every Java class and then just execute it, and that's it. So jOOQ is the easiest way. So if you have stored procedures, you should definitely have a look at jOOQ. But now enough slides. We should have a look at some code. I have the jOOQ examples projects here. Now, it has a POM, that means it's a Maven project. You can also use jOOQ with Gradle, by the way, doesn't matter. And here you can also see that I use Spring Boot in the latest version, 3.3.0, but jOOQ isn't relying on any framework. So you can use jOOQ with Spring Boot because there's a Spring Boot starter for jOOQ, but you can also use it with Quarkus. There's an extension. You can use jOOQ with Micronaut, Helidian, or you can use jOOQ with plain JDBC, for example, in a batch application. So that means that I have integration with Spring Boot. With this starter here on line 25, this starter is used to configure the DSL context. So that's the main class that we are using to create and execute the SQL statements. And this will take part of the transaction, of the connection pooling, so you don't have to care about all that. In my example, I use Flyway to do the migrations. You can also use Lickybase, it doesn't matter, or you can directly access the database, so if you don't have any migrations. Then I use Postgres in my example, but as I said, every SQL database would work. I use Postgres in my demo usually because it's the fastest database to start. Why is this important? It is important because I also use test containers to do the tests. So if you don't know test containers is a library that allows you to execute or to run Docker containers during development. So you can use that to run your tests against a database in a Docker container, and this will be better than using, for example, an H2 in-memory database, because with test containers you can run the real database and you don't have a different database for testing and for production, for example. And now let's have a look back at the diagram. Here I told you that we have this jOOQ generator. Now the question is, how do we run this jOOQ generator? And because this combination of test containers and jOOQ is very common, and also with Flyway and Lickybase, Siva from the test containers team started a small project. It's called Test Containers jOOQ CodeGen Maven plugin. And we can use that here in the plugin section of my Maven POM. And there we just have to define which test container we want to use. We want to use Postgres. We have to pass or define the JDBC driver dependency. And then in the execution section, we see that we can generate the jOOQ code. This will be generated when in the generate sources phase of Maven. It will start a Postgres database. Here we have an old version, 15.2. I could also use the latest one, 16.3, for example. This would also work. Then I can define, because I use Flyway, where are my migration scripts. I wouldn't have to do that because this is the default location and the plugin would know about that. Let's have a look at the scripts. We have just one SQL script, and this creates all the database tables, and I'm using sequences for the primary key. So these are the tables as in the data model I've shown you before. So, and finally, we want to generate the jOOQ code. jOOQ generator has a lot of options. Here I just use two. I define which database schema I should use, and I can also exclude objects. So here I exclude the Flyway schema history table. That's the table that Flyway is using to find out which version of the database currently is used. And then we have a target configuration with the package name that jOOQ generates that in the right package. Now let's run that. I just do compile, and compile will execute this test contains jOOQ CodeGen plugin. First, it will start Docker container, so it will connect to my local Docker. And then test container start is this jOOQ. container that manages the life cycle, and then it starts my Postgres database. This starts, by the way, under a second, so it's, as I said, very fast. Then we have the Postgres database on a random port, and finally Flyway run and is creating the database tables and the sequences. And then we have jOOQ. jOOQ is analyzing the database metadata, and then it will generate code. So here you see options. I could even generate from JPA, I could generate validation, and so on. There are a lot of options. I don't show you that. You can have a look at it in the documentation. And finally, it finds 15 tables, from which one is excluded, the Flyway table. It also fetches or found 10 sequences, and then it generates code. And finally, it compiles the code, and that's it. Now, you may be curious what it really generated. For that, we can have a look at the generated sources in the target directory jOOQ, and you will find the information. So the first thing that jOOQ generates is classes for all our tables. So we have an athlete table, and for that, jOOQ generates a class called athlete, and it extends from table impl. That's not very interesting. It uses an athlete record as a type. We will see that in a minute. What it's important to see is that there are constants in the code, like the athlete, or we have the ID, the first name, and so on. And this means jOOQ generates for each column such a constant. And this constant I can then later use to build my SQL statement. But what's interesting about that is also that it's not only generates the constants, it also has information about the type. So it has information, what's the name for sure of the column. So this is identical, despite if it's upper or lowercase. Then we see that it detects that it's a big int in the database. It's not nullable because it's the primary key, it's an identity. And here, the last one between the quotes, this would be the database comment. I don't know if you know that, but you also can add comments to tables and to columns. And if you have that, jOOQ will also use that comment and put it here. So because jOOQ is database first, it would also make sense to comment your database table, and then you can see the comment right here, and the developer don't need to go to the database to see the comments. He can just look at the generated code from jOOQ. And here we see that we have other types that are generated, like we also have an integer or so on. And what we also have here, we have foreign keys. That means we have references to something, to a table called athlete club. So that's the link between the athlete and the club table, and also the athlete and the organization is here. That's what is generated, and jOOQ generates also this record stuff. What is a record? A record is generated also for each table and represents a record in the database table. So if we execute SQL and select all the columns, jOOQ can return such a record. And the special thing about the record is if it has a primary key, then jOOQ will extend from something called updatable record. And updatable record is kind of an implementation of the active record pattern. That means I can read the athlete record, change the data, and then I can call a method called store, and this will write back the changes in the database. So that's what is generated. And now let's have a look at the code. Here we have a test. It's called query test. It's just a simple one. Let's start with the top. So I annotated my query test with transactional. That's the annotation from Spring Framework. This will cause the transaction to be rolled back after the execution of the test method. That's, in my opinion, a good practice because with the rollback, you don't change any data in the database, and all tests that run after your test method will not be affected by the changes you do in the test method. And then, because jOOQ has a Spring Boot starter, there is an annotation jOOQ test. Maybe you know data JPA test. These are so-called test slices. And the test slice means that depending on this test annotation I use here, Spring will only start the necessary parts of the framework. So for example, here, if I use jOOQ test, it will just start the database connection and it will start jOOQ. But if I had like a REST controller or a service, for example, or any other components, these will not be started because they are not necessary to test just the database logic. And this saves time. That's why Spring has these test slices. Then you see that I auto-wired the DSL context. That's comparable to the entity manager, for example, that you use if you use JPA. This is the starting point to write SQL. And then I have a test, find competitions. Let's have a look at it. That's the easiest way that you can use. So I use this DSL context, then I call select from. Select from is a shortcut. I could also use select and then from competition. Here, select from. And here you see that I use this meta model. So competition is from the generated code competition, the constant that represents the table. And with using that, my code will no longer compile. For example, if someone would change the name of the competition table. So if you change the database model, you regenerate the jOOQ code, then maybe your code will no longer compile because someone has changed a column or a table or any other object in the database. And then after that, I have a fetch method, and the fetch method returns a result. A result is an implementation of a list because a query could have an order by clause, so the result will be sorted. And then I have here, I use asset J in that case, where I can check if I just have one competition because my test data has just one competition. By the way, the test data is also applied with Flyway. I use here a Flyway migration with a very high version number. I could also use an after migrate file to do the same for those who know Flyway. And here I insert an organization, a series, a competition, 2 clubs, and 1 athlete. So that's all my test data I use here. It's just generated also by Flyway. So that's how I read data. Now let's have a look how I insert data. The first approach could be I use SQL. So to insert data in the database table, there is insert to. It looks more or less the same as a regular SQL statement. I can specify the columns and then I specify the values here. That's Mujinga Kambunji. By the way, she's the fastest woman in Switzerland. He has the record in 100 meter and in 200 meter in Switzerland. And then I can also do something, I returning something from the insert. So returning result will return the generated ID because, as you may remember, the IDs are generated by sequence, and I want to have that after the insert statement. And then I just say fetch 1 into, and fetch 1 into will fetch one record. So I assume that there is only one result, like you do when you get single result with JPA. And then I can say that it should transform the result in a long because my primary key is a long, and then I get the ID. Now let's run that so that we can see what's happened here. By the way, my tests also use test containers. And so it starts first, test containers creates a connection, and then it applies the flyway scripts, and then jOOQ runs. You can enable jOOQ logging by setting the logger to true. So there is this logging level org.jOOQ. You can set that to debug, and then jOOQ will log very interesting things. First of all, it logs the SQL statement. And as you can see here, it logs the SQL statement twice. Why does it log it twice? The point is, jOOQ is always using prepared statements. And if using prepared statements, you will only see this question marks as placeholders in the query, and you will not see the actual value. By the way, using prepared statements is a great thing because it prevents from SQL injection. So you will be safe against that attacks. But for debugging purposes, this is not very handy. So if you use Hibernate, you have two loggers and it will log that separately, or you can use like JDBC proxy to log that. jOOQ is very convenient because it always logs it twice, first with as the prepared statement that is sent to the database, and the second row with the inlined variables that I can see. And I also could take out this SQL statement and execute it by hand to check if it does what I expecting. That's it. And then it also returns something. It returns the ID. So maybe we can also run the first test. And then we will see that jOOQ samples the results. So it doesn't return, or it doesn't log all the rows that it fetches. In my case, there's anyway just one. But if I had like 1,000,000 records, it would just return like the first 5 elements. And this is very handy because with that, you just can immediately see if the data you returned could be what you were looking for. So now, as I said, there is this active record pattern. So using this insert is a bit annoying. You know, you have to specify a lot of stuff here. So it may be better to just use the record. Now the DSL has a method called new record, and this new record is used to create a new instance of athlete record, and it also attaches the athlete record to the DSL. So like you're using entity manager and persist, here the DSL new record more or less does the same. So this means the athlete record is known by jOOQ after the new record call. So I can set all the data and then finally call store, and store will then execute an insert statement. So let's run that as well to see if this really works. And here we have the same query, again, logged twice, once without and one with inlined variables, and we get the same result. So that means this does exactly the same, but in my opinion, this is way more convenient. And even if you have like a CRUD application like I have, so data-centric application, I could also use this athlete record to directly bind it to the UI, for example. I can also use an updatable record to update it, so I can fetch an athlete record. You see that there's also fetch optional, so I get an optional back and don't have to do a null check. Then I change, for example, the year of birth and store it, and then I check if this finally worked. So I can also use that to update. But very often we don't write data a lot, we read data a lot. And for that, we can use jOOQ as well. So I can use a select statement. And here I just select the first name, the last name, and the club name from the club table. And then I have to join the club table here because these are two separate tables. They have foreign keys. So the athlete has a club ID as a foreign key. And then I call fetch. And now I don't get the record back, or not like an athlete record or something. I get a record 3 back. That's a type from jOOQ and means that I have a record with three columns. And string, string, string are the types. So this is a typed result. I can use that here also to check. And as you can see, I can even use the meta model to access the athlete. But the point is that's not very convenient, right? So you have to use that here on the athlete. And I think there should be something easier. And for that, I created a class. It's called, I think it's the athlete DTO. That's Java record. And it exactly takes the first name, last name, and the club. So 3 strings. And I want to use that in my query test. And for sure, I can do that because I can map that to a record with fetch. So I can directly map that in a DTO, but even that is too complicated. So jOOQ has a shorthand for that. I can directly call fetch into. And what fetch into will do, it will do more or less the same. It will get the result, and then it will check if it can create an athlete DTO with this result. And because the athlete DTO has a constructor that matches the result, it will call the constructor directly. And so I really have a very convenient way to read data in DTOs. So if I want to do that directly. Now, what in my opinion is not very convenient, I have to join here, because if you know JPA, there is the JP query language where you can directly join over to one relationships in the query, and jOOQ can do that as well because he knows the database. So there is also this navigation from athlete through club. So jOOQ generates a method that returns the club table, and there is a attribute called name or a column called name. And so I have a very short statement to do that. Now, sometimes I need nested results. So let's see, here we have the first name, the last name, and the club name. But what if I want to not only have the name of the club, or if I want to have the club as a club DTO inside the athlete? For that, I created the club DTO, and I have this nested athlete DTO now, where I not only have the first name and the last name, but also have a club, and the club has the name. And this is also possible with jOOQ because jOOQ can return nested structures. So that means my select statement then looks a bit different because I have to say first name, last name. It's the same as in the query above. But then I have a value constructor. That's called a value constructor, this row method. And this row method will simply create an object out of this element here. And then it will be mapped to club. So the mapping here works as the fetch into. It will call the new operator. That means it will call the default constructor, and it's a record that matches, again, the type of the name with the club DTO, and it creates that. And if you have a look at the query that is executed now, it looks like this. So it first has a select from the first name and the last name. That's not very special, but now the magic happens because it uses a nested element here in the name with and it does the join to the club. And what we get returned here is the nested club DTO, right? So this is how nesting works. Now this is quite simple because it's just a one-to-one relationship. But what if we like to have something like this? So I like to have a DTO series with the series name, and then I would like to have a list of competitions. So the competition DTO here has just the name and the date when the competition happens. And now I would like to load that in a single query. If you know database and SQL, you know that this is not possible because the result of a SQL statement is always a table. And here we have like a nested structure. The point is there is functionality in the database for many, many years. We had like XML 30 years ago, and now we have JSON. JSON is everywhere. JSON is also in the database, and you can return JSON directly from the database. And that's also what jOOQ is using. So let's have a look at this nested projection. It looks a bit more complicated, I would say, but we will go through it. I first select the series name. So that's what I want to have in the series DTO. And then I have a multi-set value constructor. And in this multi-set value constructor, I have an inner query where I say, give me the competition name and the competition date from the competition where the competition foreign key series ID matches the series ID of the outer query. And then I have a converter and can convert the result of this inner query to some object. And here I just use a mapping method. And this mapping method will call the constructor of the competition DTO. And here again, the competition DTO matches the types because the name is a string and the date is local date. So this finally works and it fetches the data into this nested structure. And I can do a proof if I run the test. And finally, you will see here that we have a query. And this time the query uses JSON functionality. You see here JSON B aggregate, you see a JSON build array and stuff like that. And the return here in the result, you see that we have the name and then we have the second column, multi-set, but the column is not a single value. The column contains kind of JSON data that is then converted to my object. And finally, we also can delete data. It has a delete from with the where condition. And so that's no surprise that we can do that. Now, this multi-set can also be very complex because I've shown you a use case already of that, because I can create here the competition ranking list. And this data in this ranking list is fetched with one single SQL statement. So if we have a look at the query here, so I also have logging turned on, I see that I get the name of the competition. It's the 39 Jugendmeisterschaft here. We have the competition date. We have some configuration data. And then we have a multi-set. It starts with category. That means we have the category here. And if we would look further, we would have the athlete. We would have the results nested. And to see how this looks like, we can go to the competition ranking service. And now it's a bit more complicated than the simple examples before. So this is the query for the ranking list. Here I have also a record. It's competition ranking data with the competition data. Then we have a list of categories. A category is a nested directory with an abbreviation name, then some information. Then it has a list of athletes. The athletes is a record with the name, first name, last name, and a list of results. And the result finally is the event, so 80-meter, long jump, and so on, with the result and the calculated points. And this is fetched with one query. And let's have a look at the query here. So we have a select with the first nested multiset, with the second multiset, and the third nested multiset. And here we also see that I use this joins, implicit joins to do that. And we have the conversion from, and finally can call fetch one, and I just get the data out from jOOQ. So that's it from the demo. Now maybe we should answer a question. And this question could be, what do we have? Does jOOQ support NoSQL? NoSQL is not supported because jOOQ uses SQL databases. So jOOQ is made for SQL databases. The point is, it depends on the NoSQL database is if this really is necessary to have jOOQ or not. So for example, if you use MongoDB, you will store anyway nested structures like we read for the competition ranking, and so we probably wouldn't need that for jOOQ. Yes, jOOQ can do whatever SQL can. So the question was, will jOOQ be able to handle complex queries with having 5 or 10 tables in queries and joins? For sure, that's no problem, because jOOQ just transforms the DSL to a SQL statement. And that's also very interesting, and I didn't talk about that, but jOOQ is database agnostic like Hibernate. So you can change the underlying database and keep the same jOOQ code. And there's even a utility on the jOOQ web page. You can convert, for example, an Oracle SQL statement to a Postgres SQL statement, because jOOQ knows all about the specific SQL from the databases. I would say Lucas, as the main committer of jOOQ, is probably the person who knows the most database types in the world, and he also filled a lot of issues with the databases when he was creating jOOQ, or if he implements new features. Then what's the difference between jOOQ and MyBatis, or iBatis, how it was called before? The difference is jOOQ is type safe. So if we go back to answer the question here, I only can write valid SQL. That means I have the DSL and I have this meta model, so I can't write like something that is not existing. So this will not compile in my case, for example. My bad is the SQL statements are in strings, so I can do mistakes when writing the strings. And my bad is not database agnostic. That means if I change the database, I will also have to change the database queries. Now, finally, we have to maybe answer the question if when you should use jOOQ and when you should use JPA. First of all, let's have a look at what's the best features of both. So for jOOQ, the superpower for sure is querying. So we can write SQL statements, we can write nested queries, we can return nested objects. We can very easily call functions and store procedures if you need that, and it's great for bulk updates and deletes. But JPA has another superpower. JPA is this entity state transition. So if you have a complex entity model and you want to use that, and you have business logic on the entity model and you want to read the entities, change it, and then have Hibernate to do all the magic behind the scenes, then JPA is a very good things for you, because it also have something like cascading and orphan removal. So you can cascade, insert, update, and delete, for example. This will automatically happen with JPA if you add or remove, for example, elements from a list in an entity. And to finish that, you also can combine the two, because you can use jOOQ to construct the queries, and then you just can say, hey, jOOQ, give me back like the SQL string, and then you can use the entity manager, execute native query, or create native query, and execute the native query, and then the result of this query will be entities and not records from jOOQ. So you can combine both. So it really depends what you want to do. I also have a talk about CQRS, Command Query Responsibility Segregation, and there we separate the command model from the query model. And you could here say jOOQ would be a perfect fit for a query model, for example, and JPA could be a better fit maybe for a command model. So it depends how you use your data. Yep, that's it from my side. Are there any other questions?
Seems that there is no question so far. But really, I like the idea of combining both the jOOQ and GPA for query and command. That's really interesting. Like hygiene, it's really amazing.
Yeah, you will notice, or usually if I introduce jOOQ with existing customers, they usually have JPA already. And then I say, hey, this nested structure reading is very interesting. For example, if you have REST APIs and you need this nested structure, it's way better than using like Mapstruct or Model Mapper to map things, because you will not have issues with lazy loading, for example. You will not have n+1 select problems. And what often happens then, that when we are finished with introducing jOOQ, we may go ahead and remove Hibernate at all, because they notice, oh, jOOQ is so awesome, we don't need Hibernate anymore. But as you said, combining is perfectly fine. And I think really for reading data, jOOQ is in my opinion, the better approach.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simon, for this insights. Amazing session as usual. Thank you so much for being with us here in the React Jag.
Yeah, thank you a lot for having me. It was a pleasure to speak at your jOOQ.
Thank you so much. Okay, I think we are ending the session now. There is no other questions. So thank you so much, folks. Thank you so much, Simon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.